What we are dealing with, an eating machine. Shark. Mistake to claim in the waters off Amity Island.
You yell shark. We've got a panic.
This shark, swallow you whole.
Hello. He's trying to run!
What happens when a giant shark turns a peaceful beach into a deadly hunting ground? A dive into the terrifying world of Jaws 1975 as we uncover shocking facts, hidden details, and why this movie became a legendary classic. Watch till the end with SONU HUB to see why Jaws still scares audiences decades later. Jaws is a 1975 American thriller movie directed by Steven Spielberg. The movie is based on the 1974 novel written by Peter Benchley. It stars Roy Scheider as Police Chief Martin Brody, who has to deal with a huge man-eating great white shark attacking people at a popular beach town in New England. To take down the shark, Brody teams up with Matt Hooper, a marine biologist played by Richard Dreyfuss, and Quint, a tough and experienced shark hunter played by Robert Shaw. Murray Hamilton plays the town's mayor, while Lorraine Gary plays Ellen Brody, Martin Brody's wife. The screenplay was written from early drafts by Peter Benchley, while actor and writer Carl Gottlieb later rewrote much of the script during filming. Most of Jaws was filmed on location at Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts between May and October 1974. At the time, it was the first major movie to be filmed out on the actual ocean, and that caused the production a ton of problems. The filming went way over budget and also fell behind schedule. One of the biggest headaches was the mechanical sharks created for the movie. The fake sharks often broke down or simply didn't work the way the filmmakers wanted. Because of all these problems, Steven Spielberg decided to change his approach. Instead of constantly showing the shark on screen, he mostly kept it hidden and made the audience feel its presence. This actually made the movie way more intense. Spielberg used suspense, sound, camera work, and the audience's imagination to make the shark feel even more dangerous. Composer John Williams also played a huge role in creating the tension. His now famous simple musical theme became a warning that the shark was coming. Whenever that music started playing, audiences knew something bad was about to go down. Spielberg and other people involved with the movie later compared this style of building suspense to the work of legendary director Alfred Hitchcock, who was also famous for creating fear by showing less and letting the audience imagine what was coming. When Jaws was released, Universal Pictures put the movie into more than 450 theaters at once. At the time, that was a really big release for a major Hollywood movie. The studio also went all in with the marketing. The movie received a huge advertising campaign, especially through television commercials. There was also plenty of merchandise connected to the film. This aggressive marketing helped turn Jaws into something much bigger than just another summer movie. Jaws is widely considered a major turning point in movie history. It became the movie that basically created the modern summer blockbuster. The film won several awards, especially for its incredible music and editing, and it became a massive box office hit. In fact, Jaws became the highest grossing movie ever at the time. It held that record until Star Wars came out 2 years later. Both Jaws and Star Wars played a huge part in changing the way Hollywood made and marketed movies. They helped establish the modern Hollywood business model where studios focus on big, exciting movies with simple but powerful ideas that can attract huge audiences. These movies were designed to make a ton of money at the box office, especially during the summer. Studios also started releasing these major films in thousands of theaters and spending heavily on advertising to make sure as many people as possible knew about them. The success of Jaws also led to three sequels. However, Steven Spielberg and Peter Benchley were not involved in making those follow up movies. The original film also inspired a whole wave of similar shark movies and other thrillers trying to copy its success. Even decades later, Jaws remains one of the most influential movies ever made, especially when it comes to suspense, horror, and blockbuster filmmaking. In 2001, the Library of Congress selected Jaws to be preserved in the United States National Film Registry. The movie was chosen because of its cultural, historical, and artistic importance. Even after all these years, Jaws is still remembered as a classic that changed Hollywood forever. It proved that a simple idea, a giant shark hunting people at a beach, could become one of the biggest and most influential movies in history. Casting. The casting of the three principal roles in Jaws proved one of the more protracted and contested elements of the production process, reflecting Steven Spielberg's deliberate preference for performers who would not overshadow the mechanical shark, that he intended to function as the true star of the picture. Studio executives and the novel's author Peter Benchley had initially floated the idea of pairing major box office names, Robert Redford, Paul Newman, and Steve McQueen among them, with the characters of Brody, Hooper, and Quint. Spielberg resisted these suggestions, arguing that the presence of such recognizable faces would dilute the audience's ability to project themselves into the story and would risk turning the film into a star vehicle rather than a narrative in which ordinary people confront an extraordinary threat. He repeatedly stated that the shark itself should carry the marquee weight and that the human cast should therefore remain relatively anonymous so that viewers would experience the terror as something that could happen to them. For the role of Police Chief Martin Brody, the studio and various intermediaries considered a number of established leading men. Charlton Heston expressed strong interest and actively lobbied for the part. Spielberg declined, convinced that Heston's long association with heroic, larger-than-life characters would telegraph to audiences that the shark could never prevail. The director feared that Heston's mere presence would undercut the sense of genuine peril. Robert Duvall was also approached. Accounts differ on whether he was offered Brody or expressed a preference for Quint, but in either case he ultimately passed, reportedly concerned about the potential for the film to make him too widely famous too quickly. Other names circulated, including Gene Hackman and several lesser-known character actors whom Spielberg tested without finding the precise blend of vulnerability and quiet authority he sought. The eventual casting of Roy Scheider occurred almost by chance. At a social gathering, Spielberg was overheard discussing the difficulties of filling the Brody role. Scheider, then known primarily for his intense, tough guy turns in Clute, and The French connection sat down beside the director, noted his apparent gloom, and asked what the trouble was. When Spielberg described the project, Scheider simply inquired, "What about me, the director?" who had previously worried that Scheider's established screen persona might push Brody toward an overly hard-edged characterization reconsidered on the spot. Scheider's willingness to accept the part without first reading a finished script sealed the decision. Once on board, Scheider worked closely with Spielberg to soften the character, emphasizing Brody's landlocked anxiety, his outsider status on Amity Island, and his protective instincts toward his family. The collaboration produced a performance that balanced competence with palpable fear, precisely the quality Spielberg had been searching for. The search for Quint proved equally circuitous and was not resolved until only days before principal photography began. Spielberg's first choice was Lee Marvin, an actor whose weather toughness and association with hard-bitten roles seemed ideal for the Ahab-like shark hunter. Marvin declined, explaining that if he were going to spend time on a boat, he preferred to fish in earnest rather than pretend to hunt a mechanical creature. Sterling Hayden, whose own seafaring background and screen presence in films such as Dr. Strangelove and The Godfather gave him an authentic Ahab quality, was the next serious contender. Hayden likewise passed, citing either tax complications that limited his ability to work or a similar preference for real fishing over cinematic artifice. Other names were floated and discarded. Producers Richard D. Zanuck and David Brown, who had recently collaborated with Robert Shaw on The Sting, suggested the British actor. Spielberg screened several of Shaw's earlier performances, A Man for All Seasons, From Russia with Love, and sequences from The Sting, and quickly became enthusiastic. Shaw accepted the role despite personal reservations about the source novel, partly at the urging of his wife and assistant. His arrival completed the central trio only 9 days before cameras were scheduled to roll. Shaw brought a volatile intensity to the part, drawing on his classical training and his capacity for both quiet menace and explosive monologue. The famous Indianapolis speech, which Shaw helped shape and which he delivered after an initial alcohol-impaired attempt had to be reshot, became one of the film's defining sequences. Matt Hooper, the oceanographer, followed a similar pattern of late resolution. Spielberg's early preferences included Jon Voight, who declined, and a group of actors associated with The Last Picture Show, Timothy Bottoms and Jeff Bridges among them, as well as Jan Michael Vincent, Joel Grey, and Kevin Kline. None of these possibilities materialized. George Lucas, a close friend of Spielberg's, recommended Richard Dreyfuss on the strength of his work in American Graffiti. Dreyfuss initially rejected the offer more than once, convinced that a film centered on a shark would be a miserable production experience. After attending a screening of his own performance in The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz and finding it unsatisfactory, he reversed course, returned to Spielberg, and essentially begged for the role. He was cast on approximately the third day of shooting and began work the following day. Dreyfuss brought a nervous energy, intellectual curiosity, and comic timing that helped define Hooper as the modern scientific counterpoint to Quint's old salt pragmatism and Brody's everyman caution. The friction that developed between Dreyfuss and Shaw off camera, part professional rivalry, part genuine personality clash, was later incorporated into the script, enriching the on-screen dynamic among the three men. Supporting roles were filled with a mixture of established character actors and local or relatively unknown performers, many of whom contributed to the film's sense of a lived-in New England community. Lorraine Gary, then married to Universal executive Sid Sheinberg, was cast as Ellen Brody. Gary later described the opportunity as welcome at a stage in her career when she felt her age might limit future offers. The chance to work on location on Martha's Vineyard and opposite shore appealed to her. Murray Hamilton was selected as Mayor Larry Vaughan, the politician whose economic concerns repeatedly override Brody's safety warnings. Hamilton's portrayal of smooth, self-serving civic boosterism provided a necessary human antagonist alongside the shark. Carl Gottlieb, already engaged as a screenwriter and script doctor, was given the role of local newspaper editor Meadows, allowing him to remain on set and continue refining dialogue. Jeffrey Kramer appeared as Deputy Hendricks, while Susan Backlini, a stunt performer and swimmer, was cast as Chrissy Watkins, the first victim whose nighttime swim opens the film. Backlini's physical ability to endure the underwater sequences and the mechanical shark's early appearances made her an essential contributor to the film's opening terror. Smaller but memorable parts went to local residents and character players. Lee Fierro portrayed Mrs. Kintner, the grieving mother who confronts Brody after her son's death. Her scene remains one of the film's most emotionally charged moments. Jeffrey Voorhees played the young Alex Kintner. Craig Kingsbury, a Martha's Vineyard fisherman, was cast as Ben Gardner, the fisherman whose severed head provides one of the film's most startling visual shocks. Kingsbury's authentic regional accent and weathered appearance added verisimilitude. Peter Benchley himself appeared briefly as a television interviewer, a cameo that acknowledged his dual role as novelist and co-screenwriter. Additional uncredited or minor roles, beachgoers, townspeople, medical examiner, harbor figures, were filled by a combination of professional day players and vineyard locals, reinforcing the impression of a real island community under siege. The late finalization of the two supporting leads created logistical pressure. With Scheider already in place, Shaw and Dreyfuss arrived essentially at the last possible moment, forcing the production to begin without the complete ensemble having had extensive rehearsal time together. This circumstance, combined with the well-documented mechanical difficulties of the shark and the extended shooting schedule on the water, contributed to an atmosphere of improvisation and real-time character development. Spielberg later noted that both Scheider and Dreyfuss were given considerable latitude to shape their characters beyond what appeared in early drafts of the script. Hooper, in particular, evolved into a more distinct personality under Dreyfuss's influence, incorporating elements of the actor's own restless intelligence and humor. The decision to avoid major stars had consequences that extended beyond mere billing. It allowed the film's marketing to focus on the shark and the concept rather than on celebrity faces, a strategy that proved decisive when the picture opened and became a cultural phenomenon. Audiences encountered Brody, Quint, and Hooper as specific individuals rather than as extensions of pre-existing star personas. Scheider's Brody was neither the invincible lawman nor the pure victim. Shaw's Quint carried the weight of maritime myth without the baggage of a particular actor's earlier heroics. Dreyfuss's Hooper projected scientific competence without the romantic leading man aura that a bigger name might have imposed. The supporting ensemble similarly functioned as an ensemble rather than a collection of cameos. Casting choices also reflected practical considerations of budget and availability. With the production already facing cost overruns and an uncertain mechanical star, the relative affordability of Scheider, Shaw, and Dreyfuss compared with the A-list names originally contemplated helped keep the project viable. At the same time, each of the three principals brought enough prior recognition to satisfy the studio's desire for some measure of commercial insurance. Scheider had recent high-profile credits. Shaw was an Oscar nominee and a familiar face from both British and American films. Dreyfuss was rising rapidly after American Graffiti. The balance struck recognizable without being overwhelming, proved ideal for the material. Interactions among the cast once filming began further validated the selections. The documented tension between Shaw and Dreyfuss, while occasionally disruptive, generated authentic sparks that Spielberg and the writers incorporated into the script. Scenes of rivalry and mutual testing on the Orca gained an edge that might have been difficult to manufacture with more amiable personalities. Scheider's steady presence as the mediating figure among the three men mirrored Brody's function within the story, providing a grounding influence both on screen and off. Lorraine Gary's portrayal of Ellen Brody supplied the domestic counterweight to the increasingly obsessive Hunt, while Hamilton's mayor embodied the institutional resistance that prolonged the crisis. The inclusion of local talent and non-professional islanders in smaller roles contributed to the film's texture. Kingsbury's Ben Gardner, Fiero's Mrs. Kintner, and various beach and harbor figures spoke with the authentic cadences of the region. Their presence helped anchor the more theatrical performances of the leads in a believable social environment. Susan Backlini's physical commitment to the opening attack sequence established the film's willingness to place performers in genuine physical jeopardy, a commitment that continued through the later waterwork involving the principals. In retrospect, the casting process illustrated both the contingency and the intentionality of Spielberg's approach. Contingency appeared in the chance meeting with Scheider, the last-minute availability of Shaw, and Dreyfuss's change of heart after viewing his own earlier work. Intentionality appeared in the consistent refusal of larger-than-life stars, the preference for actors who could disappear into their roles, and the willingness to allow those actors latitude in shaping the characters. The result was an ensemble whose chemistry felt lived in rather than manufactured, and whose relative lack of prior association with one another allowed the relationships among Brody, Quint, and Hooper to develop organically during the difficult shoot. The secondary and tertiary casting decisions reinforced the same principles. Gottlieb's dual function as writer and actor kept the script responsive to on-set realities. Benchley's cameo provided a quiet acknowledgement of the source material without drawing undue attention. The many uncredited or briefly seen performers who populated Amity's beaches, streets, and docks created a sense of community density that made the sharks' depredations feel like an assault on a real place rather than a stage set. Even the voice cameo by Spielberg himself as a live station worker underscored the collaborative all-hands atmosphere that characterized the production. Taken together, the casting of Jaws represents a case study in how a director's vision of character relative to spectacle can shape every subsequent decision. By insisting that the shark remain the dominant presence and that the human beings confronting it remain believable, ordinary people elevated by extraordinary circumstances, Spielberg and his collaborators arrived at a group of performers whose work continues to define the film's enduring power. The process was neither smooth nor predetermined. It involved rejected offers, chance encounters, last-minute acceptances, and the absorption of real interpersonal dynamics into the narrative. Yet the final assemblage of talent proved precisely calibrated to the story's needs, allowing the terror, the humor, the rivalry, and the eventual confrontation to register with audiences as experiences shared rather than merely observed. Production development and pre-production. The road to Jaws began not in a movie studio but in the pages of a magazine. Producers Richard D. Zanuck and David Brown, who ran their own production company in partnership with Universal Pictures, each stumbled onto Peter Benchley's yet to be published novel independently of one another. Brown first encountered a description of the story in a book's column inside Cosmopolitan, the lifestyle magazine, then run by his wife, editor Helen Gurley Brown. A short write-up by the magazine's book editor summarized the plot and closed with a passing suggestion that the material might translate well to the screen. Intrigued, both producers spent a single night each reading the manuscript, and the following morning they agreed. It was among the most gripping stories either of them had encountered, even though neither had any clear idea of how such a technically demanding tale could actually be filmed. Confident enough in the material, they acquired the screen rights in 1973, prior to the novel even reaching bookstores, paying roughly $175,000 for the privilege. Brown later reflected, half-jokingly, that if the two of them had read the book a second time before committing, they might have recognized just how difficult certain sequences would be to realize on film and backed away from the project altogether. Finding a director proved to be its own ordeal. The producers first approached veteran filmmaker John Sturges, a logical choice given his experience helming another sea-set adventure, an adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. When that didn't pan out, the job was offered to Dick Richards, a newer talent whose debut feature, The Culpeper Cattle Caw, had been released the year before. Richards, however, kept referring to the shark in story meetings as a whale, a habit that so irritated Zanuck and Brown that they removed him from consideration entirely. Meanwhile, a 26-year-old Steven Spielberg was eager to take the reins. He had just wrapped his first theatrical feature, The Sugarland Express, for the very same producers. During a meeting in their office, he happened to notice a copy of Benchley's still unpublished manuscript sitting on a desk, and after reading it, he was hooked almost immediately. He would later note the story's kinship with his own 1971 television movie duel, observing that both works center on enormous, implacable threats stalking ordinary people. In fact, when the Finnish film's shark lets out its climactic death roar, the sound used was one Spielberg had repurposed from the demolition of the truck in Duel. With Richards out of the picture, the producers signed Spielberg to direct in June 1973, even before the Sugarland Express had opened in theaters. Spielberg's commitment nearly wavered before cameras ever rolled. Worried about being pigeonholed as a director of truck and shark stories, he began angling to jump instead to a 20th Century Fox production called Lucky Lady. Universal, however, held contractual leverage over the director and blocked the move. David Brown talked him back into the fold with the argument that once Jaws was behind him, he would have earned the freedom to make virtually any film he wanted. The budget at this stage was pegged at an estimated $3.5 million, with a proposed 55-day shooting schedule. Universal was eager to begin principal photography in May 1974 and wrap by the end of June, before the major studio's agreement with the Screen Actors Guild expired and potentially triggered a labor stoppage. On the question of adaptation, Spielberg wanted to preserve the novel's core plot while jettisoning most of its subplots. He was most drawn to the book's final act, the extended sequence of the shark hunt, and told Zanuck, He would take the job only if he could substantially rework the first two acts using new material while remaining largely faithful to the book for the climax. As part of the deal that secured the film rights, the producers had promised Benchley the opportunity to write the first draft himself, partly to guarantee a workable script would exist, even if a looming Writers Guild strike disrupted the production, since Benchley was not a union member. Benchley completed 3 drafts before handing the script to other writers, reportedly telling Spielberg that he had given all he had to offer. Benchley would later describe his own contribution more modestly, framing it as the basic storyline and nautical detail rather than the emotional texture of the characters, a skill he did not feel he possessed as a screenwriter. Among the changes made along the way was the excision of an extramarital affair between Ellen Brody and Matt Hooper that existed in the novel. Spielberg pushed for its removal, concerned that it would undercut the sense of camaraderie meant to develop among the men aboard the Orca. Benchley himself ended up with a small on-screen cameo as a television reporter, dissatisfied that the character still felt flat. Spielberg sought out other writers for a rewrite. Screenwriter John Byrom turned down an invitation to take a pass at the script, as did the television duo of William Link and Richard Levinson, best known for creating Columbo. The job eventually went to Howard Sackler, an accomplished playwright who happened to be in Los Angeles when the search for a new writer began, and volunteered to do an uncredited rewrite. Because both the producers and Spielberg had reservations about Benchley's drafts, they accepted quickly. It was at Spielberg's suggestion that Brody was reimagined as a character afraid of the ocean, a police chief transplanted from an urban setting who instead finds something far more unsettling on a quiet island off the Massachusetts coast. Spielberg also wanted comic relief woven into the material so the film wouldn't collapse into unrelenting grimness, and for that he turned to Carl Gottlieb, a friend who was working as a comedy writer and actor on the sitcom The Odd Couple. Spielberg sent him a copy of the script and asked what he might change, as well as whether there was a role he'd be interested in playing. Gottlieb responded with several pages of notes and expressed interest in playing Harry Meadows, the well-connected local newspaper editor. He landed the acting part roughly a week before being brought in to meet the producers about writing duties. What had originally been pitched to Gottlieb as roughly a week's worth of dialogue polishing evolved into something much larger. He became the film's primary screenwriter, effectively rewriting most of the script during the 9 weeks of principal photography. The workflow was unusually informal and reactive. Each day's scenes were typically finalized only the night before shooting, hammered out over dinners where Gottlieb, Spielberg, and members of the cast and crew batted around ideas. Much of the film's dialogue emerged organically from actors improvising at these meals, with a handful of additional lines conceived on set moments before filming. Writer-director John Milius contributed further dialogue polishes, and Matthew Robbins and Hal Barwood, who had also written the Sugarland Express, made uncredited additions of their own. Spielberg has claimed to have drafted material himself as well, though how much of it made it into the finished screenplay remains unclear. One story change he specifically pushed for was altering how the shark dies, shifting it from succumbing to accumulated wounds as in the novel to being blown apart via an exploding scuba tank, a choice he felt would deliver a more satisfying, crowd-pleasing finale. By Spielberg's own estimate, the completed script contained around 27 scenes that had no equivalent in Benchley's novel. Benchley's original inspiration for the story traced back to reading about the real-life shark fisherman Frank Mundus, who had famously landed an enormous shark in 1964. According to Gottlieb, the character of Quint drew loosely on Mundus, and Gottlieb researched Mundus's own book on shark fishing as part of his writing process. It was Seckler, however, who devised Quint's now famous backstory as a survivor of the USS Indianapolis sinking during World War II, a disaster in which many sailors were killed by sharks while adrift at sea. Precisely who deserves the greatest share of credit for the resulting monologue has been a point of long-running dispute. Spielberg has described its creation as a collaborative effort among Sackler, Milius, and actor Robert Shaw, who was also an accomplished playwright in his own right. In Spielberg's account, Milius expanded Sackler's original three-quarters of a page into a full monologue, which Shaw then further revised. Gottlieb, for his part, credits Shaw as the primary author and downplays Milius's role in shaping the speech. Casting presented its own set of challenges. Though Spielberg agreed to the producer's wish that the film feature recognizable actors, and Benchley floated names like Robert Redford, Paul Newman, and Steve McQueen for the leading roles, the director ultimately preferred to steer clear of major stars. He reasoned that relatively unknown performers would make it easier for audiences to believe ordinary people were experiencing these events, since established stars carry associations from prior roles that can distort a story's believability. In his own words, the real star of the film was always meant to be the shark itself. The first roles filled were Ellen Brody, played by Lorraine Gary, wife of Universal President Sidney Sheinberg, and Amity's mayor, played by Murray Hamilton. Stuntwoman turned actress Susan Backlini was cast as Chrissy Watkins, the shark's first victim, chosen in part because she was both a strong swimmer and willing to perform the role in the nude. Most of the smaller parts went to actual residents of Martha's Vineyard, the film's primary shooting location. One such example was Jeffrey Kramer, later a television producer, who played Deputy Hendricks. Lee Fierro took the role of Mrs. Kintner, mother of the shark's second young victim, played by Jeffrey Voorhees. The role of Chief Brody was first offered to Robert Duvall, but Duvall was interested only in playing Quint. Charlton Heston also lobbied for the part of Brody, but Spielberg felt his commanding screen presence would overwhelm the modest, small-town nature of the role. Roy Scheider became interested in the project after overhearing Spielberg at a party describing a scene in which the shark leaps onto the boat. For his part, Spielberg initially hesitated over casting Scheider, worried the actor might bring the tough guy persona from his recent role in The French Connection to a character who needed to feel more like an everyman. With only 9 days remaining before shooting was set to begin, neither Quint nor Hooper had been cast. The role of Quint went through several rejections. First, both Lee Marvin and Sterling Hayden turned it down before Zanuck and Brown, who had just finished working with Robert Shaw on The Sting, suggested him to Spielberg. Shaw was initially reluctant, disliking the source novel, but was talked into accepting the part by his wife actress Mary Ure and by his secretary, both of whom were unusually enthusiastic. Shaw later remarked that the last time they had reacted that way was to From Russia with Love, and that they had been right to push him. Shaw modeled elements of his performance on Craig Kingsbury, a real Martha's Vineyard fisherman, farmer and local eccentric, who was cast in the small role of Ben Gardner. Spielberg later called Kingsbury the truest embodiment of what Quint was meant to be, and some of Kingsbury's own offhand remarks were folded into the script as dialogue for both Gardner and Quint. A vineyard mechanic and boat owner named Lynn Murphy served as another source for some of Quint's dialogue and mannerisms, particularly in the film's third act. For Hooper, Spielberg's first choice had been Jon Voight, and other actors considered included Timothy Bottoms, Jan Michael Vincent, Joel Grey, and Jeff Bridges. It was George Lucas, a friend of Spielberg's who had directed Richard Dreyfuss in American Graffiti, who suggested Dreyfuss for the part. Dreyfuss initially passed on the role, but changed his mind after attending an early screening of another film he had just completed, The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. Unhappy with his own performance in that film and fearful it might damage his career once it was released, he called Spielberg and accepted the part in Jaws. Because the film Spielberg envisioned diverged so significantly from Benchley's novel, the director actually asked Dreyfuss not to read the source material. As a consequence of casting Dreyfuss, the character of Hooper was rewritten to better suit him and to more closely mirror Spielberg himself, whom the director came to regard as something of an alter ego for the part. Filming actor Richard Dreyfuss would later sum up the state of the production at its outset by noting that filming began without a finished script, a settled cast, or even a functioning shark. Principal photography began on May 2, 1974, on Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, a location chosen after the production had also weighed eastern Long Island. Producer David Brown explained the reasoning behind the choice by noting the production needed a modest, unpretentious vacation destination where a shark scare would plausibly devastate the local tourist economy. Martha's Vineyard also offered a practical advantage. The surrounding ocean floor maintained a depth of at least 35 feet for roughly 12 miles from shore, which allowed the mechanical sharks to be operated at that depth while staying out of sight of land. Because Spielberg wanted the aquatic sequences shot at close range to mimic what a swimmer would actually see in the water, cinematographer Bill Butler developed new equipment for marine and underwater photography, including a stabilizing camera rig unaffected by tidal movement and a fully sealed submersible camera housing. Spielberg also instructed the art department to eliminate red from both the scenery and the costumes, ensuring that the blood from shark attacks would stand out as the only red element on screen and land with greater visual force. The production initially entertained the idea of using a trained live great white shark, but this proved unworkable almost immediately. Instead, the crew built 3 full-scale, pneumatically powered mechanical sharks, affectionately dubbed Bruce, after Spielberg's own attorney, Bruce Raymer. These included a so-called sea sled shark, a complete body prop, minus its underside, towed behind a 300-foot line, along with 2 platform sharks, each designed with one side left uncovered to expose the pneumatic machinery. Mirror images of one another so that shots from either direction could be filmed. The sharks were designed by art director and production designer Joe Alves during the second half of 1973, then physically constructed between November 1973 and April 1974 at a rental facility in Sun Valley, California, under the supervision of mechanical effects veteran Bob Marty, who had previously built the giant squid for the 1954 film 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. As many as 40 effects technicians worked on the builds before the finished sharks were trucked out to the shooting location. Early in July, disaster struck when the underwater platform used to submerge the 2 side view sharks capsized, while being lowered into the water, requiring a team of divers to recover it. Each mechanical shark needed as many as 14 operators to manage its many moving components. For Quint's fishing boat, the Orca Alves and his team built two identical 42-foot vessels. The second, known as Orca Rai, had no engine of its own and was constructed specifically so it could be made to sink on cue. Jaws holds the distinction of being the first major studio production shot primarily on the open ocean, and this ambition led directly to a famously troubled shoot that blew far past both its budget and its schedule. Producer David Brown later noted that the film had been budgeted at roughly $4 million but ultimately cost around $9 million to complete, with the special effects alone ballooning to about $3 million because of the constant problems with the mechanical sharks. Frustrated crew members took to calling the picture flaws. Spielberg has attributed much of the trouble to his own perfectionism combined with his relative inexperience at the time. His insistence on shooting with a life-size shark model in the actual ocean rather than in a tank or a more sheltered body of water stemmed from his conviction that nothing else would look as convincing on screen. He later admitted that he had been naive about the unpredictability of the ocean and the hubris involved in believing a filmmaker could dictate terms to nature, saying he had simply been too inexperienced at the time to recognize how reckless the decision was. Gottlieb recalled that because there was ultimately no alternative but to keep working, the entire crew pushed through exhaustion, even though as a writer he wasn't required to be present at the ocean set every day. Those who returned each evening came back, sunburned, windblown, and coated in salt spray. Shooting on open water generated one delay after another. Errant sailboats would drift into frame uninvited. Camera equipment repeatedly got soaked. And on one occasion, the Orca itself began taking on water with the actors still aboard. The mechanical sharks malfunctioned constantly, plagued by a cascade of issues ranging from poor weather to salt water infiltrating the pneumatic hoses, frame fractures caused by water resistance, corroding external skin, and electrolytic damage. From the very first test in the water, the supposedly non-absorbent neoprene foam skin of the sharks soaked up liquid and swelled, while the sea sled model repeatedly became tangled in patches of seaweed. Spielberg later calculated that of the 12 hours the crew worked each day, actual filming time averaged only about 4 hours. Gottlieb narrowly avoided being struck by the boat's propellers, and Dreyfuss came close to being trapped inside the underwater steel shark cage. Seasickness was a near constant affliction among the cast. Shaw, meanwhile, would slip away to Canada whenever possible due to tax troubles, drank heavily during the shoot, and developed a growing resentment toward Dreyfuss, who was at the time receiving glowing reviews for his performance in Daddy Kravitz. Editor Verna Fields found herself with little usable footage to work with throughout much of principal photography. According to Spielberg, a good day yielded 5 completed scenes, an average day 3, and a bad day none at all. Paradoxically, many of these setbacks ended up improving the finished film. The screenplay continued to evolve throughout the shoot, and the unreliable mechanical sharks forced Spielberg to rely more heavily on suggestion rather than direct depiction during much of the shark hunt. For instance, the creature's location is conveyed indirectly through the floating yellow flotation barrels rather than a full view of the animal. The film's opening attack was originally scripted to show the shark devouring Chrissy outright, but it was reworked. So the sequence instead depicted Susan Backlini being yanked and dragged by cables to simulate the assault. Spielberg also leaned on repeated glimpses of just the shark's dorsal fin rather than the whole animal, a restraint that is widely credited with heightening the film's overall sense of suspense. Spielberg later reflected that the film shifted in tone from something resembling a Saturday matinee monster picture into more of a Hitchcockian thriller built on withholding information from the audience, a change he attributed directly to the shark's mechanical failures. He went so far as to call the malfunctioning shark a stroke of good fortune, one that pushed him toward Hitchcock's sensibility rather than the more overt creature feature approach associated with stop motion effects. Artist Ray Harryhausen, with the mechanical shark looking unconvincing whenever it did appear on screen, the burden of selling its menace to audiences fell increasingly on the performances. And Spielberg has said that the less real the shark looked underwater, the more he pushed his actors toward heightened naturalism to compensate. Additional footage of authentic sharks was captured separately by divers Ron and Valerie Taylor in the waters near Dangerous Reef of South Australia, where a diminutive actor was placed inside a scaled-down shark cage to create the illusion that the real sharks filmed were of enormous size. During this Australian shoot, an actual great white shark attacked the boat and the cage, and the resulting footage was so striking that Spielberg was determined to work it into the finished film. Since no diver had actually been inside the cage during the real attack, and the script following the novel had originally called for the shark to kill Hooper while he was trapped in the cage, the story had to be revised so that Hooper instead escapes, a change that allowed the dramatic Australian footage to be incorporated. Production executive Bill Gilmore later remarked that the footage shot in Australia effectively rewrote the script and spared Dreyfuss's character from the fate originally planned for him. Although the shoot had been budgeted for 55 days, it did not wrap until October 6, 1974, after a grueling 159 days on location. Spielberg later admitted that at the time he genuinely believed his filmmaking career might be finished, having heard rumors that he would never work in the industry again, given that no production had ever run 100 days over its planned schedule. He was offered multiple opportunities to step away from the project and allow it to be shut down. Spielberg himself was not present for the filming of the climactic scene in which the shark explodes, reportedly because he suspected the crew intended to throw him into the water once the shot wrapped. This has since become something of a tradition for Spielberg, who has made a habit of being absent for the filming of a movie's final scene ever since. After the vineyard shoot concluded, additional underwater scenes were filmed at the MGM Studios water tank in Culver City, using stuntmen Dick Warlock and Frank James Sparks as stand-ins for Dreyfuss during the cage attack sequence, as well as near Santa Catalina Island, California. Editor Werner Fields, who had already assembled a rough cut of roughly the first two-thirds of the film up to the start of the shark hunt, completed the edit and reworked portions of the existing footage. Zanuck later credited Fields with reconstructing certain scenes Spielberg had intended as comedic into moments of genuine terror, and reshaping some intended as frightening into moments of comedy. The Orca itself was eventually transported to Los Angeles, so the sound team could record effects both for the boat and for the underwater sequences. Test screenings led to two notable revisions. Because audience screams had drowned out Roy Scheider's now iconic bigger boat line when the shark first surfaces behind him, that reaction shot was extended and the line's volume increased in the final mix. Spielberg also decided he wanted to wring one more scream out of the audience and reshot the scene in which Hooper discovers Ben Gardner's abandoned, half-sunken boat, financing the reshoot himself with $3,000 of his own money after Universal declined to cover the cost. That underwater sequence was actually filmed in editor Werner Fields' own swimming pool in Encino, California, using a latex cast of Craig Kingsbury's head attached to a mock body and placed inside the wrecked boat's hull to replicate the murky waters around Martha's Vineyard. The crew poured powdered milk into the pool and covered it with a tarpaulin for the shoot. The post-production period stretched on well beyond what anyone had anticipated at the film's outset. Werner Fields, working largely without a substantial backlog of footage during principal photography, assembled the bulk of the film's structure only once shooting concluded and additional pickup material had been gathered. Her editing choices proved instrumental in calibrating the picture's tone, transforming certain sequences from one emotional register into another as needed. The sound department's work on the Orca, recorded in Los Angeles using the actual boat brought from Martha's Vineyard, contributed to the film's tactile sense of place, capturing the creak of the hull and the specific ambience of the vessel, both above and below the waterline. Test screenings played a pivotal role in refining the final cut. Positive audience reactions at preview screenings in Dallas on March 26, 1975, and in Long Beach on March 28, gave Universal executive confidence that the film could sustain an unusually broad theatrical release. A third and final preview, incorporating adjustments suggested by the earlier screenings, was held in Hollywood on April 24, 1975. It was after attending one of these previews that Universal chairman Lou Wasserman made the consequential decision to scale back what had originally been planned as a massive release across as many as 900 theaters. Wasserman wanted the film's popularity to build gradually over the course of the summer rather than being immediately available everywhere, reasoning that if audiences had to travel to see it, the sense of event and anticipation would be preserved for longer. Music John Williams composed the film's score, a contribution that would go on to earn him an Academy Award and later be ranked by the American Film Institute as the sixth greatest film score of all time. The instantly recognizable shark theme, a simple, relentless two-note alternating pattern, has been described in differing accounts as built on the notes E and F, or alternatively F and F sharp. Regardless of the precise notation, the motif became a defining piece of suspense music, forever linked in popular culture with the sense of imminent danger. Williams himself described the theme as grinding away at the listener in the same instinctual, relentless, unstoppable way a shark itself might behave. The piece was performed by tuba player Tommy Johnson. When Johnson asked Williams why he had scored the melody in such an unusually high register rather than assigning it to the more conventional French horn, Williams explained that he wanted it to feel a bit more threatening. When Williams first played the theme for Spielberg, picking out just the two notes on a piano, the director reportedly laughed, initially assuming it was some kind of a joke rather than the actual finished theme. Beyond the shark motif, Williams also drew on what he described as a kind of pirate music elsewhere in the score, inspired by parallels he saw between Jaws and classic pirate adventure films, aiming for material that felt primal yet still fun and entertaining. The score's rapid, percussive string writing has drawn comparisons to Claude Debussy's La Mer and Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. Critics and scholars have offered a range of interpretations of the score's meaning and effectiveness, and it is frequently cited as among the most instantly recognizable pieces of film music ever written. Music scholar Joseph Cancellara has suggested that the two-note pattern is meant to evoke the rhythm of the shark's own heartbeat. Alexander Tilsky has drawn a comparison to earlier scores by Bernard Herrmann for films such as Taxi Driver, North by Northwest, and especially Mysterious Island, arguing that such themes evoke human breathing, and further contending that the score's most powerful device is actually the abrupt silence that follows its most intense moments, such as the cutoff after Chrissy's death. The relationship between sound and silence is exploited throughout the film, since audiences are conditioned over time to associate the approach of the shark with its musical cue. This conditioning is turned against the audience near the climax, when the shark suddenly appears with no musical warning at all. Spielberg has said that without Williams's contribution, the film would likely have achieved only half the impact it did, and Williams himself has credited the score with launching his career to a new level. The two had already worked together once before on Spielberg's directorial debut, The Sugarland Express, and would go on to collaborate on nearly every one of Spielberg's subsequent films. The original soundtrack album was released on LP by MCA Records in 1975 and later reissued on CD in 1992, incorporating roughly half an hour of music Williams re-recorded specifically for the album release. In 2000, two further versions of the score reached the market. A Decca Universal reissue timed to coincide with the 25th anniversary DVD, presenting the entire 51-minute original score, and a separate recording from Vare's Saraband performed by the Royal Scottish National Orchestra under conductor Joel McNeely. Beyond the music, the film draws on a web of earlier literary and cinematic influences. Herman Melville's Moby Dick stands as its most significant artistic antecedent. Quint bears a strong resemblance to Captain Ahab, the obsessive whaling captain of the Pequod, and Quint's own monologue reveals a comparable single-minded fixation on his prey. Even the name of his boat, the Orca, nods to the natural predator of the great white shark. In both the novel and an early draft of the screenplay, Quint's death echoed Ahab, with the harpooner dragged under the water by a line tied to his own leg. A more explicit homage appears in one of Spielberg's screenplay drafts, which included a scene of Quint watching a screening of the 1956 film adaptation of Moby Dick, laughing so uncontrollably that other patrons walk out of the theater. The scene could not be included in the finished film because the necessary footage could not be licensed from the earlier film's star and rights holder, Gregory Peck. Screenwriter Carl Gottlieb also drew a comparison to Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, characterizing the story as a titanic struggle in the tradition of both Melville and Hemingway. The underwater point of view shots depicting the shark's perspective have been likened to similar sequences in two 1950s horror films, Creature from the Black Lagoon and The Monster That Challenged the World. Gottlieb has cited two additional science fiction productions from the same era as influences on how the shark itself was, or more accurately, was not depicted on screen. The Thing from Another World, which he praised as a horror film that withholds a clear view of its monster until nearly the final reel, and It Came from Outer Space, in which suspense is generated by keeping the creature largely off camera. These precedents in Gottlieb's telling encouraged him and Spielberg to focus on conveying the effects of the shark's presence rather than showing the shark itself. Film scholars such as Thomas Schatz have analyzed Jaws as a film that blends multiple genres while functioning fundamentally as an action thriller. It borrows heavily from horror, retains the structural bones of a nature-based monster movie, and incorporates elements associated with the slasher genre. Its second half operates simultaneously as a buddy film, built around the interplay of the three men aboard the Orca, and as a form of supernatural horror in which the shark takes on an almost demonic quality. Critic Ian Freer has described Jaws as fundamentally an aquatic monster movie in the lineage of earlier creature features such as King Kong and the Godzilla franchise, a comparison echoed by critic Charles Derry as early as 1977. Spielberg himself has cited the 1956 American release Godzilla King of the Monsters as a formative childhood influence, admiring the skill with which it convinced audiences the events on screen were actually happening. Other critics, including Neil Sinyard, have pointed to parallels between Jaws and Henrik Ibsen's play An Enemy of the People. Gottlieb has acknowledged that he and Spielberg privately described their own film as a combination of Moby Dick and An Enemy of the People. Ibsen's play centers on a doctor who discovers that a seaside town's prized mineral springs, a key source of tourist revenue, have become contaminated. When he tries to warn the townspeople, he is instead ostracized and loses his position. This narrative shape is mirrored closely in Jaws through Brody's conflict with Mayor Vaughn, who refuses to acknowledge the shark's presence for fear of scaring away summer visitors until further attacks in broad daylight ultimately prove Brody right. Sinyard has described the film as a definite fusion of Watergate-era political anxiety and Ibsen's dramatic template. Jaws has also drawn substantial attention from academic film critics interested in its ideological subtext. Stephen Heath has connected the film's underlying themes to the Watergate scandal, which had recently convulsed American politics, arguing that Brody functions as a stand-in for the white, male middle class in a story notably devoid of black characters and containing almost no significant female presence, restoring public order through an unglamorous, decency-driven form of heroism. Heath extends his analysis further, examining Jaws as an emblematic example of cinema functioning as pure industrial product, selling itself on the raw pleasure of the movie-going experience in service of perpetuating the film industry's own profitability. Andrew Britton, by contrasts the film's more optimistic tone with the post-Watergate cynicism of Benchley's novel, suggesting that narrative changes such as Hooper's survival and the shark's explosive demise transform the story into a kind of communal exorcism, a ritual restoring the audience's confidence in the broader social order. He argues that the film's power depends on the audience's collective jubilation at the shark's destruction, a moment he reads as symbolizing the eradication of evil itself, and sees Brody's arc as affirming the idea that a single ordinary, principled individual can still meaningfully affect social change. Film historian Peter Biskind takes a somewhat different view, arguing that the film does retain a measure of post-Watergate distrust of institutional authority, given that its only human villain, apart from the shark itself, is the town's self-interested mayor. Yet Biskind also notes that unlike many other films of the New Hollywood era, which tended to frame their conflicts as countercultural heroes battling entrenched authority, Jaws instead pits its characters against a menace indifferent to social or economic status, threatening everyone equally. Where Britain contends the film largely sidesteps the class tensions present in the novel, Biskind identifies meaningful class distinctions embedded in the finished film and argues they matter a great deal. In his reading, Order must ultimately be restored, but not through Quint, whose working class toughness and self reliant independence come across in the film as unpredictable and faintly dangerous. Hooper, by contrast, is associated with technological expertise and inherited wealth rather than hands on experience or self made success, and is accordingly sidelined from the story's climactic action, though less permanently than Quint. Britain, meanwhile, sees the film as primarily concerned with the vulnerability of children and society's obligation to protect them, generating an overarching sense that family life carries supreme value, a theme he connects to broader questions of ideological and cultural stability. Frederick Jamison's analysis emphasizes the shark's symbolic ambiguity and the many different ways audiences have interpreted its meaning, from a stand in for external threats like communism or the developing world to more personal anxieties about the unreality of modern American existence and the desire to suppress awareness of mortality. He argues that the shark's very open endedness is itself ideologically significant, allowing genuine social and historical anxieties to be reframed as simple conflicts between humanity and the natural world. Jameson further interprets Quint's death as symbolizing the downfall of an older populist strand of American identity rooted in the New Deal era, while reading the surviving partnership of Brody and Hooper as an allegory for an alliance between traditional law and order values and the emerging technocratic power of multinational corporations, one from which, in his view, audiences unknowingly find themselves excluded even as they celebrate its triumph. Critic Neil Gabler has offered a somewhat different framework, describing the film as dramatizing three competing approaches to solving a crisis: scientific expertise embodied by Hooper, a more spiritual or intuitive approach embodied by Quint, and ordinary common sense embodied by Brody, with the film ultimately endorsing Brody's everyman approach as the one that succeeds. The film's intensity was significant enough to generate at least one documented instance of what has been termed cinematic neurosis, reportedly affecting a 17-year-old female viewer while the film was still in theatrical release. This condition describes a pattern in which exposure to a film triggers new or worsened psychological distress in a viewer. In the case cited, symptoms began as sleep disturbances and anxiety before escalating a day later into screaming episodes and convulsions. This particular case helped establish Jaws, alongside The Exorcist, as a notable example within medical literature of films capable of provoking acute stress reactions in audiences, and it was later cited in research by Brian R. Johnson, examining how susceptible general audiences are to cinematic stress triggers. Johnson's research found that portions of the general population could indeed be induced into measurable stress responses by cinema, with Jaws specifically implicated as a trigger, although he was unable to isolate a single definitive cause, whether suspense, graphic content, or the music itself. A separate 1986 study by researcher G. Sparks found that particularly violent films, Jaws among them, tended to provoke the most intense audience reactions overall. Release Theatrical Universal committed roughly $8 million to marketing Jaws, an outlay that included an unprecedented $700,000 spent specifically on national television spot advertising. The marketing blitz saturated primetime network television with roughly 24 30-second commercials airing each night between June 18, 1975 and the film's opening 2 days later. Beyond television, film scholar Cyril Cockburg has described Universal's overall promotional strategy as an unusually innovative, tightly coordinated campaign for its era. As early as October 1974, months before the film's release, Zanuck Brown and Benchley made the rounds of television and radio talk shows to promote both the paperback edition of the novel and the coming film adaptation. The studio worked with publisher Bantam to settle on a single title logo that would appear consistently across both the paperback cover and all film advertising. At the center of this joint promotional push were two elements: John Williams's musical theme and the now iconic poster image of the shark rising beneath an unsuspecting lone female swimmer. That poster art was adapted from the paperback's original cover, created by Bantam staff artist Roger Castell. The Seiniger advertising agency reportedly spent 6 months refining the poster design. Agency principal Tony Seiniger later explained that early attempts simply didn't read as frightening enough until the team settled on a composition viewed from directly beneath the shark, fully exposing its teeth. Merchandising surrounding the film's release was similarly extensive. Writing in 1999, media scholar Graham Turner characterized Jaws as accompanied by what was likely the most elaborate collection of movie tie-in products yet assembled, spanning a soundtrack album, t-shirts, plastic tumblers, a making-of book, the source novel itself, beach towels, blankets, shark costumes, toy sharks, hobby kits, iron-on transfers, board games, posters, shark tooth necklaces, sleepwear and water pistols, among other items. The Ideal Toy Company produced a board game called The Game of Jaws, in which players used a hook to try to extract objects from the shark's mouth before its jaws snapped shut. Enthusiastic reactions from test screening audiences in Dallas and Long Beach in late March 1975, combined with the commercial success of Benchley's novel and the early stages of the marketing campaign, generated considerable interest from theater owners and encouraged Universal's plan to open the film simultaneously in hundreds of theaters. After Universal chairman Lou Wasserman attended a preview screening, he decided to scale down what had initially been proposed as a release spanning as many as 900 theaters, wanting the film's popularity to build gradually over the entire summer rather than being available everywhere at once, so audiences would need to travel to see it rather than catch it conveniently close to home. Even scaled back, the several hundred theaters ultimately booked for the opening constituted an unusually broad release for the period. At the time, wide simultaneous openings carried a certain stigma, frequently associated with films of dubious quality. The strategy was more common on the exploitation side of the industry, where it served to blunt the impact of negative reviews and weak word of mouth before they could take hold. There had been a handful of recent exceptions to this pattern, including the theatrical release of Billy Jack, the original release of its sequel, The Trial of Billy Jack, the Dirty Harry sequel Magnum Force, and recent entries in the James Bond franchise. Even so, the prevailing model for major studio releases still involved opening in a limited number of big city theaters, generating a wave of premieres before prints were gradually distributed to additional markets based on audience response. The remarkable success of The Godfather in 1972 had already begun nudging the industry toward wider releases, but even that film debuted in only 5 theaters before expanding the following weekend. On June 20, 1975, Jaws opened across 464 screens in North America, 409 in the United States, and the remainder in Canada. The combination of this unusually broad distribution with an equally unprecedented national television advertising campaign produced a release strategy virtually without precedent at the time. A month earlier, Columbia Pictures had used a broadly similar approach for the Charles Bronson thriller Breakout, though that film's commercial prospects were considerably more limited, and it remains a common misconception that Jaws was the very first film to employ an advertising saturation strategy of this kind. Universal President Sid Sheinberg reasoned that the costs of a nationwide marketing campaign would be amortized more efficiently on a per print basis compared to the costs associated with a slower, staggered rollout. Buoyed by the film's early success, its release expanded further on July 25 to nearly 700 theaters and again on August 15 to more than 950. Its international rollout followed a similar template, combining intensive television advertising with wide releases. In Great Britain, for example, the film opened that December across more than 100 theaters. Simultaneously, the film has also enjoyed several notable theatrical revivals in the decade since its original release. For its 40th anniversary, it returned to roughly 500 selected theaters across the United States on Sunday, June 21 and Wednesday, June 24, 2015. A further theatrical reissue followed on September 2, 2022, marketed largely under the title Jaws in 3D, not to be confused with the franchise's second sequel, Jaws 3D, featuring the film in both IMAX and RealD 3D formats as part of the 40th anniversary celebrations surrounding another Spielberg classic, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Announcing the reissue, RealD 3D representative Travis Reed remarked that the film had redefined what it meant to be a summer blockbuster and that the new format would let audiences experience the classic thriller in an entirely new way. For the film's 50th anniversary, the 2025 TCM Classic Film Festival hosted a special screening followed by a limited theatrical re-release running from August 29 through September 4, 2025, paired with a commemorative exhibition at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles. Home media Jaws holds a notable distinction in home entertainment history. The MCA DiscoVision release of the film in 1978 was the very first Laserdisc title ever marketed in North America. A second Laserdisc edition followed in 1992, and a third and final version arrived in 1995 under MCA La Universal Home Video's signature collection line. This later release took the form of an elaborate box set, including deleted scenes and outtakes, a new 2-hour documentary on the making of the film directed by Laurent Bouzereau, a copy of Benchley's novel, and a CD pressing of Williams's soundtrack. On broadcast television, ABC aired the film for the first time on November 4, 1979, immediately following its theatrical re-release that year. This inaugural US broadcast drew a Nielsen rating of 39.1, capturing 57% of the total viewing audience. At the time, the second largest audience ever recorded for a televised film, trailing only Gone with the Wind, and the fourth highest rated broadcast overall. In the United Kingdom, an estimated 23 million viewers tuned in for the film's first television broadcast in October 1981, making it the second largest British television audience ever recorded for a feature film, behind only Live and Let Die. MCA Home Video issued the film's first VHS release in 1980. For the 20th anniversary in 1995, MCA Universal Home Video released a new collector's edition tape featuring a retrospective making of documentary. This edition went on to sell approximately 800,000 units across North America. A final VHS edition, timed to the film's 25th anniversary in 2000, arrived with a companion tape containing a documentary, deleted scenes, outtakes, and the original theatrical trailer. The film made its DVD debut in 2000, again tied to the 25th anniversary and supported by a substantial publicity push. That release included a 50-minute documentary on the making of the film, an edited version of material originally produced for the 1995 Laserdisc set featuring interviews with Spielberg, Scheider, Dreyfuss, Benchley, and other members of the cast and crew, alongside deleted scenes, outtakes, trailers, production photographs, and storyboards. The DVD reportedly shipped 1 million copies within its first month on the market. A 30th anniversary edition followed in June 2005, unveiled at the Jaws Fest festival on Martha's Vineyard, incorporating many of the supplemental features from earlier releases, along with the full 2-hour Boozero documentary and a previously unreleased interview with Spielberg, recorded on set back in 1974. The film arrived on Blu-ray at the second Jaws Fest event in August 2012, packaged with more than 4 hours of bonus material, including a documentary titled The Shark is Still Working. That Blu-ray release, timed to coincide with Universal's centennial celebrations, debuted at 4th place on the sales charts with more than 362,000 units sold. The film later received a 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray release for its 45th anniversary on June 2, 2020, followed by a further 4K UHD edition for its 50th anniversary on June 17, 2025, accompanied by a new Boozero directed documentary titled Jaws at 50: The Definitive Inside Story. Reception box office Jaws opened in 409 theaters and immediately set a record with a $7 million opening weekend, going on to gross a record-breaking
21,106 seat sales.
354 over its first 10 days in release, a sum that recouped its production costs almost immediately. Within its first 59 days, spread across 954 play dates, the film had crossed the $100 million mark. In just 78 days, it had overtaken The Godfather to become the highest grossing film in North American box office history, surpassing that film's earnings of $86 million and becoming the first movie ever to generate $100 million in domestic theatrical rentals. It went on to spend 14 consecutive weeks as the #1 film in the United States. Its original theatrical run ultimately generated $123.1 million in rentals, and subsequent re-releases in 1976 and again during the summer of 1979 pushed its total rental earnings to $133.4 million. The film's international rollout began in December 1975, and its performance overseas closely mirrored its domestic success, setting box office records in Singapore, New Zealand, Japan, Spain, and Mexico. On January 11, 1976, Jaws became the highest grossing film in the world, with worldwide rentals of $132 million, surpassing the $131 million previously earned by The Godfather. By the time the third installment of the franchise reached theaters in 1983, trade publication Variety reported that the original film had accumulated worldwide rentals totaling $270 million. Jaws held the title of highest grossing film of all time until it was overtaken by Star Wars, which was released 2 years later. Star Wars surpassed its North American record roughly 6 months after its own release and went on to set a new global record in 1978. Taken across its various theatrical runs during the 1970s, Jaws ultimately grossed $260 million in the United States and Canada and $470 million worldwide. As of 2014, Jaws had sold an estimated 128 million tickets in the United States and Canada, placing it 7th among the highest grossing films of all time when adjusted for ticket price inflation. and roughly 243 million tickets worldwide. Adjusted for inflation, its worldwide gross stood at approximately $2 billion as of 2011, making it at the time the second most successful franchise film behind only Star Wars. In the United Kingdom, it ranked as the 10th highest grossing film released between 1975 and 2018, earning the equivalent of more than £80 million in 2018 currency terms, with an estimated 16.2 million admissions. The film has also sold 13 million tickets in Brazil, a total first exceeded by Titanic in 1998, and it remains the sixth most attended film in that country's history. On August 29, 2025, Jaws returned to theaters for its 50th anniversary re-release. In the United States, Canada, it earned $950,000 during Thursday night previews and $3,080,000 on its opening Friday, ultimately taking in $8.1 million over its three-day opening weekend, enough for second place at the box office, behind only the horror film Weapons, before climbing to $9 million across the full four-day Labor Day weekend. As of September 18, 2025, the 50th anniversary reissue had earned $12.8 million in the United States and Canada, and an additional $3. $4 million internationally, for a worldwide total of $16.2 million all from that release alone. Taking the full history of its theatrical releases into account, Jaws has grossed $280 million in the United States and Canada and $215 million in other territories, for a cumulative worldwide total of $495 million. Critical response: Jaws was met with largely favorable reviews upon its initial release. Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times awarded the film 4 stars, describing it as an unusually effective action picture and a genuinely scary thriller elevated by characters who felt like fully realized human beings rather than mere plot devices. He compared its ability to frighten audiences to The Exorcist, though he found Jaws a somewhat gentler kind of scare, drawing more on outdoor adventure thrills than supernatural horror. Variety's Eddie Murphy praised Spielberg's command as a director and singled out Robert Shaw's performance as exceptional. Pauline Kael, writing for The New Yorker, called it one of the most gleefully perverse scare pictures ever produced, noting a level of energy and electricity that recalled an early Woody Allen film. Complete with a comparable strain of humor, Frank Rich, writing for New Times Magazine, praised Spielberg's rare gift among American filmmakers of the period for pure visual storytelling, observing that some of the film's most terrifying passages are precisely the ones in which the shark never actually appears on screen. Judith Crist, writing in New York Magazine, described the film as an exhilarating top-tier work of adventure entertainment, praising both its performances and its technical accomplishments. Rex Reed praised the film's tense action sequences and concluded that it succeeded as a gripping horror film on nearly every level. Critic David Thompson drew a comparison between Spielberg's work on Jaws and Francis Ford Coppola's work on The Godfather, arguing that Spielberg similarly asserted creative control and skillfully organized the elements of pure roller coaster entertainment without losing sight of the story's deeper resonances. Thompson credited the film's suspense to meticulous craft and a sly self-awareness about its own manipulative editing, adding that later, inferior sequels only underscored how much more engagingly Spielberg had captured the ocean, the danger, the shark's unsettling beauty, and the vitality of the human characters opposing it. Vincent Canby of the New York Times observed that the film never generates much genuine sympathy for any of the shark's individual victims, arguing that in lesser films of this type, characters exist mainly as functional elements of the plot rather than fully drawn individuals, though he ultimately conceded that the film qualified as enjoyable, well-crafted nonsense. Not every response was positive. Los Angeles Times critic Charles Champlin objected to the film's PG rating, arguing it was too disturbing for children and likely to unsettle even sensitive adult viewers, and criticizing its land-based sequences as dull, clumsily staged, and weakly written. Even as he acknowledged the film's excessive exploitative reliance on shock for its impact, Marsha Margill, writing for Films in Review, felt the film was well worth seeing for its back half, but considered the earlier stretches before the shark hunt truly begins cluttered and overstuffed. William S. Spector, writing in commentary, dismissed the film as numbing, manipulative entertainment aimed at audiences already saturated with sensation, while Molly Haskell of The Village Voice offered a similarly skeptical assessment, likening the experience to being subjected to mechanically precise shock therapy. The film's most persistent point of critical complaint has centered on the visible artificiality of its mechanical shock. McGill singled out one particularly unconvincing close-up of the animatronic creature, and in a 2002 retrospective review, online critic James Berardinelli suggested that without Spielberg's tightly controlled sense of suspense, audiences would likely have found the mechanical shark's cheesy appearance more comical than frightening. Halliwell's film guide offered a similarly mixed verdict, acknowledging genuinely suspenseful and frightening sequences while criticizing the film as loosely narrated and occasionally flatly directed, burdened by excessive dialogue, and when the creature is finally shown, at length a less than convincing monster. The film's achievements were formally recognized at the 48th Academy Awards, where it won 3 Oscars: Best Film Editing for Verna Fields, Best Original Dramatic Score for John Williams, and Best Sound for Robert Hoyt, Roger Heman, Earl Madery, and John Carter. It was additionally nominated for Best Picture, losing to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Spielberg was notably passed over entirely in the Best Director category, a snub he reportedly resented for a long time afterward. Beyond the Academy Award, John Williams' score also collected a Grammy Award, the BAFTA Award for Best Film Music, and the Golden Globe Award for Best Original Score. Verna Fields supplemented her Oscar win with the American Cinema Editors Eddie Award for Best Edited Feature Film, and the film itself was voted favorite movie at the People's Choice Awards. Jaws also picked up nominations for Best Film, Best Director, Best Actor for Richard Dreyfuss, Best Screenplay, Best Editing, and Best Sound at the 29th British Academy Film Awards, along with nominations for Best Motion Picture Drama, Best Director, and Best Screenplay at the 33rd Golden Globe Awards. Spielberg received a Directors Guild of America nomination for the DGA Award, and the Writers Guild of America nominated Peter Benchley and Carl Gottlieb's screenplay for Best Adapted Drama. In the decades since its release, Jaws has been consistently cited by both critics and industry professionals as one of the greatest films ever made. It placed 48th on the American Film Institute's 1998 list of the 100 greatest American films, though it slipped to 56th when the list was revised a decade later. The AFI has also ranked The Shark itself 18th on its list of the 50 greatest movie villains, placed Roy Scheider's Bigger Boat Line 35th on its list of the top 100 movie quotations, ranked Williams' score 6th on its survey of the 100 greatest film scores, and positioned the film second behind only Psycho on its list of the 100 most thrilling American films. In 2003, The New York Times included the film among its list of the 1,000 greatest movies ever made, and the following year, Jaws topped Bravo's 5-hour television's special ranking the 100 scariest movie moments in film history. The Chicago Film Critics Association named it the sixth scariest film ever made in a 2006 survey, and in 2008, Empire magazine ranked Jaws the fifth greatest film in history, while also placing Quint 50th on its list of the 100 greatest movie characters of all time. The film has continued to appear on numerous other best of lists compiled by critics and publications, including Leonard Maltin, Entertainment Weekly, Film for Rolling Stone, Total Film, TV Guide, Vanity Fair, and Variety. In 2001, the United States Library of Congress selected Jaws for preservation in the National Film Registry, formally recognizing it as both a landmark horror film and the prototype of what would come to be known as the summer movie. In 2006, its screenplay was ranked 63rd on the Writers Guild of America's list of the greatest screenplays of all time, and in 2012, the Motion Picture Editors Guild named it the 8th best edited film in cinema history, based on a survey of its own membership. Scholars and critics have also credited the film with reshaping the business of Hollywood filmmaking itself. According to film historian Peter Biskind, Jaws diminished the traditional influence of print criticism by making it far more difficult for a film to build an audience gradually on the strength of quality reviews and word of mouth, while simultaneously sharpening studio appetites for rapid blockbuster scale profits, effectively encouraging every studio to chase its own version of Jaws. Scholar Thomas Schatz has written that the film recalibrated the profit potential associated with a major Hollywood hit and redefined its status as both a marketable commodity and a broader cultural phenomenon, effectively ending a 5-year box office slump for the industry while ushering in an era defined by expensive, technologically ambitious, fast-paced thrillers. The film also played a defining role in establishing summer as the preferred season for releasing a studio's most anticipated films. Previously, winter had traditionally been reserved for prestige and awards-oriented releases, while summer had often functioned as a dumping ground for pictures with lower commercial expectations. Alongside Star Wars, Jaws is widely regarded as marking the beginning of a new business model built around so-called high-concept films, projects built on premises simple enough to be easily summarized and marketed, and correspondingly marking the gradual decline of the new Hollywood era, during which filmmakers had enjoyed comparatively greater creative autonomy within the studio system. Biskind has described Spielberg, somewhat provocatively, as the vehicle through which the major studios began reasserting control over an industry that had briefly ceded significant creative power to individual directors. Jaws also left a lasting imprint on the horror genre more broadly, to the point that Ridley Scott's 1979 science fiction horror film Alien was reportedly pitched to studio executives using the shorthand description Jaws in space. A wave of films centered on man-eating animals, frequently aquatic in nature, followed throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, including Orca, Grizzly Mako, The Jaws of Death, Barracuda, Alligator, Day of the Animals, Tintorera, and Eaten Alive. Spielberg has singled out Piranha, directed by Joe Dante and written by John Sayles, as the best of these imitators. Among the various international productions that borrowed heavily from Jaws, 3 emerged from Italy: Great White, which prompted a plagiarism lawsuit from Universal and was in some markets even marketed as though it were part of the official Jaws franchise; Monster Shark, later featured under the title Devilfish on the television series Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Deep Blood, which folded in supernatural elements absent from the original. The 1976 Brazilian comedy Bacalhau parodied Jaws by substituting a killer cod for the shark, and the 2009 Japanese horror film Psycho Shark was released in the United States under the title Jaws in Japan. More recently, filmmaker Takashi Yamazaki cited Jaws and Spielberg as influencing 2023 kaiju film Godzilla -1, and director Denis Villeneuve named Jaws among his all-time favorite films, crediting it as an influence on his 2021 adaptation of Dune. The film's cultural footprint extended well beyond cinema itself. Much as the shower scene in 1960s Psycho transformed everyday showers into a lingering source of anxiety, Jaws is widely credited with instilling a lasting fear of ocean swimming in many viewers, with some reportedly even questioning whether sharks might be lurking in landlocked bodies of water, such as Lake Michigan. Reduced beach attendance during the summer of 1975 has been attributed in part to the film's influence, alongside a corresponding rise in reported shark sightings. The film is still regarded by many as having reinforced damaging misconceptions about shark behavior and is frequently cited as a contributing factor behind the so-called Jaws effect, which some have blamed for inspiring waves of recreational fishermen to participate in shark hunting tournaments that killed large numbers of the animals. Benchley himself later became an advocate for shark conservation, arguing that the menace depicted in his novel had been entirely fictional, and Spielberg has likewise expressed regret over the decline in shark populations he believes was linked, at least in part, to the book and film's influences. Conservation organizations have similarly noted that the film has made public efforts to protect sharks considerably more difficult. The franchise the original film spawned includes 3 sequels, each meeting with progressively cooler critical and commercial reception combined. Their domestic box office totals amount to barely half of what the original film earned on its own. In October 1975, Spielberg told a film festival audience that making a sequel to anything amounted to little more than a cheap carnival trick. Though he did briefly consider directing the first sequel himself after its original director John D. Hancock was dismissed only days into filming, ultimately prior commitments to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which he was making with Richard Dreyfuss, made the idea impossible. Jaws 2 1978 was directed instead by Janot Swark, with Scheider, Gary Hamilton and Jeffrey Kramer all reprising their original roles. It is generally regarded as the strongest of the sequels. Jaws 3D 1983 featured none of the original cast, though it was directed by Joe Alves, who had previously served as art director and production designer on the first 2 films. Starring Dennis Quaid and Louis Gossett Jr., it was released in 3D format to largely negative reviews, and the 3D presentation did not transfer successfully to television or home video releases, where the film was subsequently retitled simply Jaws, 3 Jaws, The Revenge 1987, directed by Joseph Sargent, co-starred Michael Caine and brought back Lorraine Gary as Ellen Brody. Entertainment Weekly later ranked it among the worst movie sequels ever produced. While all 3 sequels turned a profit at the box office, with Jaws 2 and Jaws 3D both ranking among the 20 highest grossing films of their respective release years, both critics and audiences were largely unimpressed by each installment.